Hello and welcome to the D
and A of Home Interiors, the podcast which is all about empowering you to make confident interior and furnishing decisions for your home. I'm Audrey, founder of Audrey Whelan Interior Design.
And I'm Deirdre, founder of youfurnish.com, such 100 plus furniture retailers on one website. The DNA of Home Interiors is proudly sponsored by checkatrade.com. If you need help with your next home improvement project, you can search from over 39,000 recommended, vetted and monitored trades on checkatrade.com.
So on today's podcast, Deirdre and I are delighted to be joined by a very interesting guest. This is John Allsopp, an architect. Now, John actually got in touch with us after listening to the podcast. He thought maybe we were in Ireland, but then discovered actually that my studio was literally just down the road. So it was a fantastic way to meet. We've had numerous chats over the past few months. It's really, really interesting from my perspective to hear how much work John has done with interior designers in the past. So there's lots and lots of insight and inspiration that we are really looking forward to sharing with you all today. So John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to see and meet you both, Audrey and Deirdre.
Wonderful. I've got a very Irish question to ask you. Do you know Kirsty Allsopp, or is that just a coincidence on the surnames?
Well, actually, no, I don't know her, but her surname is spelled the same way that mine is, which is quite rare. It's 2 L's and 2 P's. And we're both in property, but I've never met her, no.
Ah, there we go. See, whenever we see some similarity in Ireland, you're like, you must know that person, some long distant cousin.
No, I'm afraid not. The story is not that exciting, but I have watched her on TV, if that helps.
Very good, very good. So, John, where did your journey all begin, or how did you get into what you currently do? And maybe why don't you tell us yourself in your own words what you currently do?
Well, I am an architect, and in the traditional sense, I make buildings, and most of my work is residential, but I've worked in all sorts of different areas. I've done restaurants and hotels and theaters and all sorts of things over the years. But I would say that my passion is, to become an architect came through building. And actually, that came about in my teens when I used to build skateboard ramps, because I was skating every day, amongst other things. And my dad would ask me, what is that going to lead to? And actually led to architecture, incidentally. We used to build ramps out of plywood and 2x4s, as we called them back in the day. And we, in doing that, we actually got familiar with construction materials. And I think from my point of view, the two main things were that one, I really got a feel for materials. And, when I draw a line these days, I really know what that piece of wood or that brick feels like. And the other thing is that I got a passion for community and having an activity that's not just drawing or not just building, but actually having a sort of community personal element to it. So I think that those two things hand in hand have sort of kept me going. They're the fuel of my sort of architectural engine that is still running as fast as it was since, I suppose I was 13, 14 years old.
Wow. And how long ago is that? How long have you been working in the profession now?
How long ago is that?
Not that we're trying to add things up or anything.
Well, no, that was, let's just say it was in the 80s. I was a skater in the 80s, in the great old days of the 80s, from skateboarding point of view. So it's since then. And I went into architecture school in the 90s, not knowing absolutely, as far as architecture was concerned, I knew absolutely nothing. And it just so happened that when I went into a 4-year course, and I happened to land in a year where they did an experiment with us. There were 3 of us, where they compressed the 4-year course into a 3-year course. So knowing lots about building things, but nothing at all about architecture, I landed in this course and also then had to figure out a way to catch up with everyone else. And the way that I did that was that I went into the library and I literally went through every single architecture book in the library, reading most of them, Forrest Gump style, from beginning to end. And I caught up pretty fast. And so that's how I had my start.
And I know a lot of your work is in residential interiors now, but was that where it started, or did you have a particular direction you wanted to pursue as a student, or what sort of happened then as you entered architecture as a profession after you graduated?
Yes, well, I think that as a student, I mean, I think I would add a third part to that architectural engine that was added when I was a student. And that was sort of a passion for architectural history. And that came about, I mean, I think that the thing that that I discovered then was that a lot of my architectural heroes had made their biggest statements with houses. And I think that a house is very interesting in that respect because it's small, if you compare it to, say, a skyscraper. It's small, but it has to serve multiple functions in this one small package. So from a sort of spatial and building point of view, it has a lot of roles to play in one small package. But then on the other hand, you're dealing with a client who wants you to do something for them that's very, very personal. It's the ultimate impersonal, and perhaps an interior designer gets even more personal. But from an architect's point of view, it's as personal as you get. You're building the space that they're going to live in and spend all their time in, and they themselves are going to be passionate about the spaces that they inhabit and how they're going to use them. So, for me, the house is really the ultimate statement. And if you yes, then that's really why I'm still to this day I'm very, very happy to do houses because I think they're a challenge and they're exciting.
So it's really interesting because I suppose the house is the home, and given COVID, we're all spending so much longer in our homes. And I often find that when you move into a space or you're in a hotel room or a different space, you often see little design flaws. So it might be that you have to get out of bed to go switch off the light rather than hopefully switching it off from the comfort of under the duvet. So where does that line and where does the job scope, I suppose, begin and end in terms of the functionality, John, between an architect and then actually, I suppose it also would link in with the interior designer. But how do you then sort of visualize how the home should work and flow? And I'm thinking of masking tape to see if something fits when I'm looking at furniture, but you can't do that for a whole house. How do you sort of make sure that you're creating the right solution?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is that it's a process. So you don't come, I mean, I think you might see the odd architect in a movie and he comes with a grand plan and he unfurls it and it's all there by magic, but it doesn't happen like that at all. So I think that's the most important part. It's a process if it's only between you and the client, you start with baby steps. You start with what they want. And I always try and capture what their passions are, what they want to get out of it in the end. So that process begins with very, very general ideas from my point of view, but a lot of listening. So when you think of the sort of listening versus talking proportion, at the beginning, you're doing a lot more listening than you are doing talking. And as you go through the process, which can take months and hopefully not years, but sometimes it does, you refine and refine what you're going to talk about. And I say that very generally because you're talking to the client with and our mode of communication is drawings and images and models and that sort of thing. And ultimately you're talking to builders to get them to price it. And that mode of communication is going to be spreadsheets and details and that sort of thing. So I think that you make that building out of having a dialogue, and that dialogue is sometimes one-to-one, but usually it's group dialogue, and it's a very collaborative thing. And then when the building comes to be, I think that hopefully you've listened and you've talked enough, and also test driven it in a sense. You test drive it on paper, you test drive it in your mind, so that you don't make those mistakes of having to reach too far for that switch. So that's really, I think that's the main lesson that you'd have to learn in order to avoid those problems and to get the best possible result.
So, John, I'm loving this concept of collaboration. So you talking about the collaborative process with the client. And I have noticed over the years that sometimes clients who know that they need or want an architect on the project can feel apprehensive about the idea that perhaps an architect would want to dictate the process a bit more than what you've described. And maybe that fear of an architect wanting, to impose their own design ideals on the project, or perhaps thinking that the architect may want the project sort of more so as a portfolio piece rather than, purely the best outcome for the client. What would you think on this subject? Are there architects that do operate like that? And also, is that something that you have perhaps carved as a bit more of a niche for yourself to operate in this collaborative way?
Yes, well, I'll start by saying that there definitely are architects that work in that way, for better or for worse. But I have to qualify that by saying that there are also clients who want to be told what to do, and some clients actually approach architects with that in mind. I think that where it comes as a shock or where it's jarring is where they want to do something more collaborative, and they've gone to an architect who wants to be more dictatorial, and I think that part of the reason that that's often a problem is that we are taught in school, and unfortunately we're still taught in this way. We are given this idea of architecture as a sort of leading, commanding, egocentric role, and two, as a sort of romantic, artistic statement. So we want to make our statement in that way. And I think that, and I say we, but I think by saying that, I mean that is how often, usually, we're educated. But I think that ultimately, when you get out into the real world, you have to deal with the client who may be an individual for, say, a house, or an organization for a larger building or a shop or something. And a lot of other realities start to kick in. So even if you think that, you often can't achieve that. So I think it's much better to start from the point of view of saying, I am going to be collaborative. And actually, the best thing for everyone is if the project has the ego and the project is excellent, and then everybody wins. So that's my approach for taking on a project and working with other people, and that makes me very comfortable working with interior designers, lighting designers, taking lots of input from the clients themselves, because I know that in the end, if the project is excellent and it benefits from that input, then everybody is going to be the winner.
So that's really interesting. Have you ever had a client come with a carte blanche, go do what you want?
No. I'm trying to think. I've been an architect for 20 years. I'm trying to think back. I would say no, and particularly since I've worked with clients, in my entire career, and with different flavors, all the way through. I've worked with clients who are very demanding, and they're usually quite successful people in their own, in their own way. So they usually have an opinion. I haven't ever had, let's just say, the privilege, if it is such, of just having a carte blanche and starting from zero.
And it's really interesting because you mentioned the collaborative approach. So it's working with the clients, it's working with the builders, the interior designers, you said lighting designers. Who else do you sort of work with within your realm, or how many touch points do you typically have on a project or may have on a project?
Well, it depends on the project, as you can imagine, but I try and get in as much as, let's just say, the brief and the budget can manage. I think that I always believe that you will be richer for having a more collaborative environment. So if we have a project, say, with a lovely garden, and it's somewhere, we just don't know where it might be, but let's just say it has a lovely garden which has the potential for a landscape designer to give some input, then I would explore that as a possibility. But I think, again, with the looking at this idea of a process, that will come out through the process of that dialogue initially with the client. Usually, I try and establish that as early as possible, because the earlier you can get the team on, then the more synergy there is. If you try and bring on an interior designer when you're 90% through, then it's, there will definitely be something abortive, and it's not really productive. So it's sort of working that out very early with the client, and then bringing on that team as necessary.
And John, speaking of interior designers, I'm in awe to hear that you worked for Kelly Hoppen. So I'd love to know, is there anything about your time working with Kelly Hoppen, who's such a big name in the interior design world, that has perhaps influenced, how you currently work?
Yes, definitely. I would say that she is, as you can imagine, she's very successful. She is tough as nails when she needs to be. But I would say first thing that really stood out to me is that even though she's tough, she's fair, and I've always enjoyed the fact that she will reward good work, and if you've made a mistake, you will know. And I think that that's not, for me, a negative thing at all. That, for me, is part of the learning process and part of the development. But actually, the most important lesson that I learned from Kelly Hoppen is that she runs her office like a family, and she genuinely does. It's not just a superficial thing. We have, and I'm going to do an estimation now, just sitting here, because obviously we're sitting in different spaces, but let's just say there's a table where everyone sits and eats. It's probably about 25 feet long. Let's just say that's, going towards 6-7 meters. And everyone sits and eats together. I think that's, a critical sort of social function of the office. And we genuinely communicate, I'm not there anymore, but when I was there, we genuinely communicate as a group. We help each other. We have to do projects overseas with very, very demanding clients and demanding circumstances. And I think that the atmosphere that she cultivates in the office itself then, transplants itself to these other locations where we're working at a manic pace, in difficult conditions. And so I think that I would say that atmosphere, that family atmosphere, which is very genuine, is without doubt the most valuable bit of experience that I got from there.
Quick shout out for our sponsor, checkatrade.com. Search recommended tradespeople online with checkatrade.com. So John, I've got a question for you. Do you prefer working with an empty site that you can do a new build, or do you prefer working with older buildings?
Ooh, I love older buildings, I have to say. I think that when you've got, and I'm going to hesitate and not say that I'm necessarily preferring older buildings, because an empty site is like gold in London, and if you get an empty site, then of course you're going to jump. But I think that the thing about an older building is that you begin with character. And you begin with a language that, the building might have a particular look. You walk onto the site and it has a particular smell. These are things that you're probably not, it's not the most obvious bits of observation and perception from an architectural point of view. But I think that, an existing building has so much going for it, from a sort of multi-sensual to spatial perspective, that it gives you a lot of richness to work with. So you don't have to start with by scratching your head and saying, "Oh my God, where do I go from here?" But I would say to caveat that a virgin site in London is a special thing, and you very rarely have that opportunity. So it would be great to have one. I haven't done one in years, but I really do love older buildings.
So if I'm a customer who is looking for an architect to come onto a project, and I've never hired an architect before, what do I need to know? What do I need to look out for? Like, if I see a portfolio, should I be looking for people that have already done jobs like I'm doing, or should I be more looking at the output of their portfolio to see whose designs, light a fire in my heart more than others? What do I look out for, both on the positive and also on the downside, where, I might make a mistake, or some highlights where it would lead to conflict maybe down the line?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to meet the person, because you're going to have, especially if you're building a building or doing renovations, you're going to have a relationship with that person for many months. They're going to be intimately involved in your life. So I think it's really important that you get on. That's the number one thing above everything else. Yes, most people actually go looking for people who have, go looking for architects, say, who have done projects that are similar to what they want to do. But I actually think that is not the top priority. I mean, like, not even close. I think that personality and the potential for relationship is by far and away. And I would say if that's on a level of 10, then somewhere down 5 or 6 is where the portfolio lands. And then it would also help from a sort of personality and relationship point of view to find out from other people what the experience working with that architect was like, because that will be critical for you as well. I mean, generally speaking, if you're doing your home, your life is turned upside down in one way or another. And a good architect or a good interior designer is doing a lot more than just designing and building. They're doing a bit of counseling as well. They're doing all sorts of things. They are reassuring you and holding your hand through the process. So I think that, that's number one for sure.
And John, when you do work with clients, do you generally bring in the tradespeople? Do you tender out for the work that's going to be done, or would you be solely contracted to do the architecture, and would the clients typically then organise the other aspects of the project?
Usually, just looking back at my experience, I have chosen like a possibility, like a range of subconsultants. Whether that was their engineers or even interior designers. It all depends on who the project comes to first. But if the project comes to me first, and let's say after early discussions, I think that there should be an interior designer involved, and because we're going to move a bit of concrete, we need to have an engineer involved. Usually what I do with, say, the engineer is that, I would get 2 or 3 possibilities of people who I've worked with before. But if the client has a suggestion, which sometimes happens, I would add them to the list. And then with interior designers, I usually work a little bit differently. And that, for interior designers, what I normally do is if the client has no idea who they want to work with, I usually recommend 2 or 3 interior designers to the client. And then I sort of step back and let them take over from there. Because I think that as I was saying earlier, the relationship between an interior designer and an architect is even more intimate than, an interior designer and a client, is more intimate than that of an architect and a client. So I don't really want to get involved in that discussion. I usually just, I listen to what they want. I know a few interior designers. I'm looking at one now, and I recommend according with a rough idea of what I think they might be happy with. So, and then I just let them make that relationship and make that choice.
And yes, speaking of interior designers, and we do have a lot of interior designers who listen to the podcast, so I know it would be of interest. It is something that is more unique than it is common, I would say, for architects to talk about bringing interior designers in that early in the process. And, so often in the interior design community, there is that feeling that, projects or clients who get in touch will get in touch that bit too late than would be ideal. And even though they may have had an architect on the project, those inputs, I suppose, that could have been looked at earlier on, have not been considered. Is this the way you have always worked, or is this something that has been inspired by you working in a design studio yourself in the past?
Yeah, it's definitely been inspired by working with 2 interior designers. I was sort of the in-house architect for 2 interior designers, and before that, I had worked with interior designers as an architect. With both of us being external to each other. But I didn't really have the feel for what interior designers do until I actually worked for one. So I think that that's definitely the reason for that. And I would also say that, in terms of bringing people on early, I think that, first of all, if the client trusts you, and that comes out of the relationship, I think that part of the benefit of that trust is that you can not only create a project which is going to be the best possible project, but I think that one of the things that I think that I could offer to the client as my little niche is that, having learned all of these tricks of the trade from interior designers and other people, lighting designers and the others, is that, if you get that team together early and well, you can actually save money on the project by making good design decisions. In other words, putting time and effort into the design and the details, which then gives you the benefit of having usually a project which looks as though it costs more than it looks like. And I think that comes about through a genuinely collaborative design process. So I think that's a win for everyone, but I think it takes, the client's trust for you to do that early, because if you're telling them, well, you're going to have to spend more money to have somebody else, they have to trust you that will benefit them in the end. And I think that as an architect or as an early person on the project, if you have that big picture view, you can actually get that benefit in the end.
Yeah, that's so valuable for a client, isn't it? He just, without the prior experience of doing a project previously, you just wouldn't know unless you have that kind of advice on board to say, yes, do all this thinking early on, let it all be part of the master plan rather than kind of eking it out. And, you've got your walls already built, maybe your kitchen in, and then you're thinking, oh, if only I could have fit a certain size dining table. And that could have been possible if the kitchen island wasn't as big or whatever it might be. But yeah, sometimes it is just sort of incremental, isn't it, to the detriment sort of that overall end result.
Yeah, I think that what you've said just now is absolutely the key. Is having that master plan sort of attitude. It's not sort of the Lord leaning over the plan and saying, well, I'm going to tell you where everything is. It's more about having that big picture view and avoiding that horrible thing, which is abortive work. If when everyone's working together, then you don't have to make those abortive decisions, or at least if everyone's working together in a timely manner, then you don't have to make those abortive decisions. So that's another plus that you can add to the list.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting as well to be able to allow people to have that overall end vision. Like sometimes I find people are shocked to think, oh, can I even think about, the size and style of my dining table? That's just something that's freestanding. It's not part of the build. But that idea of actually saying, yes, you can visualize the whole thing. And then when you're happy with the whole thing, actually start to literally put those foundations in and start to, make it a reality.
Yes, and absolutely, and I think that as you say that, you make me think of something else, which is that if you are able to visualize the whole thing, depending on the size of the project, that does give you the ability to say, well, I'm going to break this into, say, 2 phases, because I don't want to mortgage myself to death and do everything in one go. So I'll do it in 2 bits, but because I have a master plan, because I have an overall view, the first bit is going to be completely productive in relation to the second bit. You won't have any abortive work, and all you would have done is saved yourself a financial burden that should be larger than it should be, and it gives you a bit more flexibility in how you manage your life. So, and that will come about by having a big picture view. So there are lots of benefits, and I think that it's a good professional's job to communicate those benefits, and hopefully you've built enough trust that the client will listen, because in the end, it's their home and they will benefit.
So, John, going back to their home, I think interior design and what people want to be reflected in their home is often reflective of what trends are in the market. So materials, velvets, colours, grey walls, as we recently had. Does architecture move in the same way, or is it not really trend-led for materials or design concepts?
It's just a bit slower. I think that with interiors, you're dealing with materials that you could change in theory, of course, cost permitting from season to season. If you have a fabric finish, if it's upholstery, if it's window treatments, you can change that quite quickly as long as you're willing to pay for it. So in other words, if the trend for window treatment is going to reflect the fact that somebody's going to try and sell you that fabric because they sold you a different fabric last season. So I think that yes, interiors has the potential at least to move much more quickly. With architecture, you're generally you're laying bricks and pouring concrete, so that can't change from March to September. That's really if it's done well, it's around for a couple of decades, if not more, of course. So yes, we change, but it's much more slow. Everything's much slower.
And on the subject of materials, are there particular materials that you really like working with?
Well, I have a soft spot for timber. And that goes all the way back to skateboarding, because I have the most natural feel for how timber works and what the opportunities are, how you can make it beautiful, how you can, and do it economically as well. So that's, I do love a very, I love a good use of wood. So that's one thing. But then I'll generally say that, I think that I love to spend time with the details. And those details might mean the way that wood is connected to a bit of metal, or the way that the bricks are arranged and laid. So what I would like to do in most cases is start off from a point of view of saying, I'm going to try and do this with natural materials. So if you're going to use bricks, is it possible to do this with bricks that are not covered over with a layer of concrete so it's all smooth? Is it possible to do it with timber in a way that's finished so that you get the natural color and the grain? So I'm always looking for that opportunity. It's not always possible and it's not always the best thing to do, but I think that if you can find a way to express the best qualities of the material, whether it's wood, metal, or steel or bricks, I think that you're on your way to a good thing.
Yeah, I love that idea. I suppose it's really what we might describe, kind of two things comes to mind, either trying to be true to materials. So using the material not just from a functional perspective, but also allowing the visual qualities of it to be, your finished result. But it also makes me think of a phrase that I still love, although it was something that was kind of ingrained in me as a student all those decades ago, form follows function. So to really think of, the function, and then that the actual form and the aesthetic of it is led by the function. Or is that something that you think of?
Yes, I do. But what I've found is that it goes back and forth. I think that because things are so unpredictable in the design process, whether it's for external reasons or because of people changing their minds or you discovering something new, the form and function positions switch. So you might start off in the position of thinking that your form is going to follow the function, but then sometimes, you found a beautiful material and you absolutely want to be able to use that in a beautiful way. And then, the function follows a little bit of the form. So for me, it's never a clear-cut thing. But as a general rule, I think that if form does not follow function in some way, it's going to fall down because ultimately the space has to be used. It's not like a work of art that's sitting in a gallery. It's the thing about architecture is it has to be practical. So yes, definitely, that's the end of the argument. Always is that the form will follow the function in some way.
So given COVID and how people are spending more and more time in their home, are you finding that your designs or people's attitudes are changing, be it to, rooms, home gyms, offices, outdoor space, or maybe it's coming through in materials? I was speaking to somebody lately who said that they were putting in copper sinks because apparently copper is very antibacterial resistant, which I didn't know. And I was like, that's really interesting. So they were predicting that would be a trend that would come through because of people's awareness of germs. Are you seeing anything in relation to impacts of COVID?
Well, your friend is right, because I've already seen instances where they're pushing the use of copper because of copper's antibacterial abilities. So yes, that's happening. I think that the main thing that I'm finding is really, this word lifestyle, which is very generalized and it's sort of used and abused. But people's lifestyles are changing without a doubt. And I think that to some degree, they're never going to go back because you've tasted this sense that, okay, it's not necessary to work from the office all the time. People will go back to work, but do you need to go back to work 5 days a week? And if you're home 1, 2, 3 days a week, then that space becomes much more important. So yes, I'm seeing that people are putting a lot more value in, and this is from a design point of view and also from a property point of view, because I think they're one and the same really, because ultimately they're serving the lifestyle of the person living there. But I think that people put a lot of value in outdoor space, which should not be a surprise, I suppose, and having comfortable living space. And I think that internally, and I think that we can't also discount the fact that if we're in lockdown, let's say, and we're spending hours upon hours looking at each other all day long, sometimes you just want to break out and be in somewhere, in a different space. So having, I think that having that ability to either escape to the outdoors or to other rooms within your own property has a very high value. And then just if you expand out a little bit more, I think that the sense of the neighborhood and the high street, these are all things that are just have a much greater sense of value these days, because we are feeling as though we're stuck really inside. And I think that having that ability to have a bit of an escape is critical.
So, John, I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of our time together, but one question that I can't resist asking you is what would your dream project be to work on?
Oh, well, I will say that my dream project is going to be somewhere that I can also use it for starters. And that would be a home for starters. So it's going to be a house, and it's going to be a house in a beautiful natural environment. So I think that, I'm always, if I go back to my early days in architecture, I've always loved spaces, and especially homes that have a little bit more than just the building, that have a context, that have a sort of location and an atmosphere. So if you gave me a beautiful sort of seaside location that's facing the west, and I can see the sunset, I'll take that. I'll build a house which has a very sort of open aspect to the outdoors, and that would be a place I would love to live. So I would say my dream project is probably to build that holiday home facing the sunset in the Caribbean.
Wow, sounds amazing.
Well, I think on that note, John, you had me there, so you'll have to build a neighbouring house next door for me, because I went in on that. But thank you so much for all of your stories today and for sharing an insight into being an architect. It's been fascinating.
Well, thank you both for having me.
Thank you, John. If you enjoyed our podcast, we would be delighted if you could rate, review, and subscribe on your favourite podcast provider. This will help others who are seeking home and furnishing advice and inspiration discover the DNA of home interiors. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter at the DNA of Home Interiors.
If you are looking for inspiration and help in designing your home interiors, take a look at Audrey Whelan's masterclasses on audreywhelan.com/events. And don't forget to check out youfurnish.com, a search and comparison website which helps connect people with amazing furniture from over 100 retailers. We designed it to solve the problem we and thousands like us faced furnishing our homes. And now we are really excited that everyone can search, discover, compare and shop for their home all in one place.
Thank you to our sponsor checkatrade.com for their support in bringing this episode to you. And most importantly, thank you all for listening today.
We hope you can join us next time.